Most people walking around today have absolutely no clue how bad things have really gotten in America. And it's not because they're not paying attention. It's because the problems aren't visible anymore. They're buried deep beneath the surface, hidden, diluted, papered over by headlines that barely scratch the truth. But every now and then, something slips through the cracks. A leaked number, a viral video, a shocking headline, and suddenly the mask falls away, revealing the rot underneath. One of those moments happened when Americans discovered that someone had over $23,000 sitting on a food stamp card. That wasn't a typo, and it wasn't an exaggeration. It was the actual balance in one of the very states now facing federal scrutiny for refusing to cooperate with fraud investigations. And the worst part? It wasn't an isolated case. It was a symptom, a warning flare that something foundational was breaking. Then came the next shock. An $8 billion fraud scheme out of Minnesota, involving individuals who had direct ties to politicians, complete with photos, donations, and connections that raised questions nobody wanted to answer. This wasn't petty theft. It was targeted, systematic, and engineered within programs meant to help children, seniors, and people with disabilities. $8 billion siphoned away and money stolen from the very people the system was built to protect. And just when Americans thought the news couldn't get any more unbelievable, new data revealed that nearly half of the immigrants from certain conflict regions were on long-term federal assistance. At the same time, multiple states were refusing basic transparency about where taxpayer money was going. Today, we're going to break down what's really happening behind the scenes, why fraud exploded, why oversight collapsed, how political incentives twisted the system, and most importantly, why the decisions being made right now will shape the country your children and grandchildren inherit. There's a feeling a lot of Americans have today, especially older generations, who lived through times when institutions worked differently. It's a quiet, nagging sense that something is deeply off. You can't always point to one thing. It's a combination of rising prices, chaotic news cycles, and government decisions that don't seem to align with reality on the ground. Every so often, a story pops up that makes you freeze. A benefits card loaded with tens of thousands of dollars. A fraud scheme so large it sounds fictional. Or a whistleblower revealing that oversight mechanisms, the very safeguards meant to prevent abuse, haven't worked for years. These events are not random glitches. They're warning signs. Think of them like the check engine light in your car. You can ignore it for a while. You can keep driving hoping it goes away. But the longer you wait, the more expensive the damage becomes. Eventually, the engine gives out. And that's exactly where America is today. The warning lights have been flashing for years, but most people didn't understand what they meant. And many leaders didn't want the public to know the truth. Because once the truth was exposed, accountability would follow. When federal investigators finally demanded data from the states, basic information about who was receiving benefits and whether they were eligible, something astonishing happened. Around 30 states complied, but 21 refused. Those that complied revealed a scale of fraud that shocked even longtime auditors. Dead people receiving benefits, individuals collecting assistance in multiple states. Some people enrolled in half a dozen programs simultaneously. This wasn't a handful of bad actors. It was an entire ecosystem of exploitation that had been running for years. And it didn't happen by accident. You don't accidentally approve benefits for someone who died 10 years ago. You don't accidentally send duplicate payments to the same person across multiple states. These failures only occur when oversight collapses. For seniors who remember a time when government integrity actually mattered, this felt incomprehensible. How did it get this bad? How did billions of dollars disappear without anyone stepping in? The unsettling answer is simple. People did notice. Whistleblowers spoke up. Auditors flagged the issues. But the political will to fix the problem simply wasn't there. Why? Because fixing it required confronting uncomfortable truths about beneficiaries, about oversight failures, and about political incentives. It required acknowledging that some officials looked the other way because enforcing the rules might cost them politically. And then came the Minnesota earthquake. For years, whistleblowers inside Minnesota's state government tried to warn leaders about massive fraud in programs designed to help vulnerable populations, especially children, seniors, and disabled individuals. Their warnings were dismissed. Some were even threatened. And the fraud didn't just continue. It grew. It metastasized. When federal investigators finally intervened, the numbers were staggering. Estimates ranged from several billion to $8 billion in fraud. One program intended to distribute a few million in housing assistance ballooned into more than 100 million. How does a program meant to cost 2 million end up exploding 50 times over? Only in an environment where no one is watching. But fraud on its own is one thing. What shocked Americans even more were the photos and donation records that surfaced, showing individuals, later charged with fraud, standing beside high-ranking politicians. Campaign finance documents revealed maximum donations, high-dollar contributions, and access that raised legitimate concerns. Now, taking a photo with someone doesn't make a politician guilty. Accepting a legal donation doesn't prove wrongdoing. But the pattern spoke louder than any single image. Whistleblowers reported intimidation. Oversight agencies ignored red flags. And individuals, later indicted for fraud, were contributing significant sums to political campaigns. To older Americans who grew up believing in accountability, this was more than corruption. It felt like betrayal. But Minnesota was only the beginning. When federal audits expanded nationwide, the discoveries grew even darker. Patterns began emerging, linking fraud, long-term dependency, immigration loopholes, and failures in vetting. Investigators noticed that among certain immigrant groups arriving from conflict zones, long-term welfare dependency was extraordinarily high, between 40% and 50% or more. Not temporary assistance, but multi-year and multi-generational support. And in some cases, individuals involved in fraud had prior criminal histories or deportation orders. Some had even been denied asylum in other countries due to fraud, yet somehow were granted protected status in the United States. These findings raised questions many people are afraid to ask publicly, not because the questions are cruel, but because they challenge a narrative that has dominated political conversations for years. If vetting systems fail, if documentation is unreliable, if oversight is weak, how can the system sustain itself? In early 2025, the administration finally drew a line. Travel restrictions expanded to include countries that couldn't provide adequate identity verification or background information, not because of who the people were, but because their governments were unable or unwilling to confirm identities. It was a safety issue, not a political one. Alongside these restrictions, immigration enforcement operations increased in cities that had become hotspots for fraud, places like Minneapolis and New Orleans. These operations targeted individuals with criminal records, outstanding warrants, prior deportation orders, and links to ongoing fraud cases. Within weeks, dozens were arrested, including convicted murderers, gang members, and individuals directly tied to fraud networks. And the obvious question emerged: how were these people still in the country? The answer lay in sanctuary policies. For years, certain cities refused to cooperate with federal immigration authorities. They released individuals even when detainer requests were issued. They prioritized ideology over enforcement, and the consequences rippled across the nation. For millions of Americans, especially seniors who remember a different time in the country's history, this was the final breaking point. It felt like the system wasn't just failing them, it was working against the very people it was supposed to protect. Now, as America confronts these issues head-on, the stakes couldn't be higher. Fraud, oversight collapse, political incentives, immigration failures, they're all connected. And the decisions being made today will determine the future of the country for generations to come. This isn't about partisanship. It's not about attacking one group or defending another. It's about understanding reality, a reality that was hidden for far too long. A reality that finally, undeniably, has come to the surface. America's check engine light has been blinking for years. Now the hood is finally open, and what we find inside will determine whether the system can be repaired or whether the damage has already been done. It's one thing to debate immigration policy in the abstract, from a distance, through speeches, headlines, and carefully crafted talking points. It's another thing entirely to release convicted criminals back into neighborhoods simply because local officials refuse to cooperate with federal law enforcement. That isn't compassion. That isn't justice. It's a complete breakdown of the rule of law, the one principle a functioning society cannot survive without. And predictably, when enforcement operations finally began in earnest, the backlash was instant and loud, the streets filled with protests. The media erupted into two sharply divided narratives. Politicians lined up to either condemn the operations or defend them. And the national divide, already deep, became even wider. Even more emotionally charged, even harder to bridge. Let me paint the picture for you. In New Orleans, as federal agents moved through neighborhoods conducting operations, protesters flooded the streets. Some local businesses taped signs on their windows, declaring that immigration enforcement agents were not welcome inside. One homeowner went even further, hanging a massive banner on their balcony proclaiming, "Immigrants make America great." It became a symbol, quickly photographed, shared, and amplified all over social media. Community activists organized rallies. They marched with megaphones, delivering speeches about injustice, about fear, about community solidarity. Local officials held press conferences, criticizing the federal operations as heavy-handed, cruel, and inhumane. On the surface, it appeared to be a spontaneous grassroots uprising, an entire community united against the actions of the government. But if you stepped away from the cameras, away from the activists, away from the carefully curated online narratives, and actually spoke to the ordinary people who lived in those neighborhoods, you heard something very different. Their voices weren't amplified on cable news. They weren't trending on social media. They weren't standing in front of microphones. But they were living the reality. Many of them were relieved, truly relieved. They were grateful that someone was finally doing something. They thanked the federal agents. They whispered concerns about individuals they knew were involved in criminal activity. They offered tips, quietly, discreetly, because they wanted their streets back. They wanted safety. They wanted order. One federal official described walking through a neighborhood in New Orleans and being stopped repeatedly by residents who said quietly, "Thank you for being here. We've been asking for this for years." That contrast tells you something important. It tells you that the loudest voices aren't always the most representative. It tells you that the people making the most noise aren't always speaking for the community. And it tells you that sometimes what looks like a widespread movement is actually a small, highly motivated group amplified by cameras, activists, and media coverage. Of course, there were legitimate concerns, and we should acknowledge them honestly. Large-scale enforcement operations always carry risks. There were reports of individuals being stopped, even though they were in the country legally. There were families frightened by the sudden appearance of federal agents. There were children who didn't understand why their parents might not come home that night. These are real human consequences. They matter. They deserve empathy. But here's the side the media rarely covers. For every family disrupted by enforcement, there were families who had already been harmed for years by criminals the system refused to deport. There were communities terrorized by gang members who should have been removed long ago. There were seniors whose identities were stolen and used for welfare fraud. There were disabled individuals whose benefits were reduced because programs had been drained by fraudsters who never should have been eligible in the first place. These stories rarely make headlines. They don't generate emotional viral clips. They don't fit neatly into political narratives, but they are just as real, and in many cases, far more devastating. For Americans who see the entire picture, for those who remember when laws were consistently enforced, when consequences were predictable, when borders meant something, the protests can feel disconnected from reality. They can feel like theater, organized outrage, political posturing designed to score points rather than solve problems. And then there was the incident that went viral nationwide. A congresswoman showed up at an active enforcement site and later claimed she had been pepper sprayed by federal agents. She released videos. She made dramatic statements. She portrayed herself as the victim of government overreach. The story took off until the actual footage came out. Body cam recordings, bystander videos, security camera angles. They showed a different story. She wasn't pepper sprayed. She wasn't targeted. She was obstructing the operation, crossing barriers, inserting herself into situations designed to be controlled and dangerous. She appeared, by all indications, to be manufacturing a moment for political gain. And when the truth came out, the narrative collapsed. That moment symbolizes so much of what's wrong today. Facts have become secondary to feelings. Narratives outrank evidence. Political advantage outweighs public safety. And ordinary Americans, the people who simply want clarity, order, and truth, are left more confused and divided than ever. So let's step back and look at the bigger picture, because all of these individual stories, the fraud, the protests, the political theater, the refusals to cooperate, are symptoms of something much deeper. They're pointing to the same underlying crisis. The same structural weakness that has been ignored for decades. What we are really witnessing is the long-term consequence of a system that was allowed to erode slowly over time. Fraud was tolerated because confronting it was politically inconvenient. Immigration laws were selectively enforced because full enforcement was controversial. Oversight was weak because accountability was uncomfortable. And year after year, the cracks widened. Think of it like a dam. At first, the cracks are tiny. A little water leaks through. It's manageable, so no one fixes it. Leaders tell themselves it's fine. They say the structure can hold. But over time, the cracks get bigger. More water pushes through. Fixing it becomes harder, more expensive, more disruptive. So they delay again and again until the dam is no longer leaking. It's failing. That is where America is right now. The cracks have been visible for years. Auditors saw them. Whistleblowers reported them. Common sense made them obvious. But fixing them required courage, real political courage, to make decisions that were unpopular, uncomfortable, and in some cases career-ending. And for a long time, that courage simply didn't exist. But something has shifted in recent years. Maybe it was the unprecedented scale of fraud finally becoming undeniable. Maybe it was ordinary Americans saying enough. Maybe it was a change in leadership. Whatever the reason, the corrections that were postponed for decades are now happening, and they are happening fast. And that brings us to the future, because what's happening right now is not just a series of temporary fixes. It's the beginning of a turning point, a reset, a corrective movement that will shape the next several decades of American policy. If these efforts succeed, if fraud is reduced, if immigration enforcement returns to order, if transparency becomes mandatory, if accountability is restored, then America will have proven that the system can be repaired,